Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about the 1960s. Mr. Green, great. The decade made famous by the narcissists who lived through it. Hey, me from the past. Finally, you and I agree about something wholeheartedly. But while I don't wish to indulge the baby boomers' fantasies about their centrality to world history, the 60s were an important time. I mean, there was the Cold War, Vietnam, a rising tide of conservatism despite Woodstock, racism. There were the Kennedys and Camelot, John Paul, George, and to a lesser extent Ringo, and of course there was also Martin Luther King Jr. So the 1960s saw people organizing and actively working for change both in the social order and in government. This included the student movement, the women's movement, movements for gay rights, and a push by the courts to expand rights in general. But by the end of the 1960s, the anti-war movement seemed to have overshadowed all the rest. So as you'll no doubt remember from last week, the civil rights movement began in the 1950s, if not before, but many of its key moments happened in the 60s. And this really began with sit-ins that took place in Greensboro, North Carolina. Black university students walked into Woolworths and waited at the lunch counters to be served, or more likely, arrested. After 5 months of that, those students eventually got Woolworths to serve black customers. Then in 1961, leaders from the Congress on Racial Equality launched freedom rides to integrate interstate buses. Volunteers rode the buses into the Deep South, where they faced violence, including beatings and a bombing in Anniston, Alabama. But despite that, those freedom rides also proved successful, and eventually the ICC desegregated interstate buses. In fact, by the end of the 60s, over 70,000 people had taken part in demonstrations, from sit-ins to teach-ins to marches. But they weren't all successful. Martin Luther King's year-long protests in Albany, Georgia didn't end discrimination in the city, and it took JFK ordering federal troops to escort James Meredith to class for him to attend the University of Mississippi. The University of Mississippi, America's fallback college. Sorry, I'm from Alabama. So the civil rights movement reached its greatest national prominence in 1963, when Martin Luther King came to my hometown of Birmingham, Alabama, where there had been more than 50 racially motivated bombings since World War II. Television brought the reality of the Jim Crow South into people's homes as images of Bull Connor's police dogs and water cannons being turned on peaceful marchers, many of them children, horrified viewers, and eventually led Kennedy to endorse the movement's goals. Probably should mention that John F. Kennedy was president of the United States at the time, having been elected in 1960. He was assassinated in 1963, leading to Lyndon Johnson. All right, politics over. Anyway, in response to these peaceful protests, Birmingham jailed Martin Luther King, where he wrote one of the great letters in American history. Doesn't have a great name, Letter from Birmingham Jail. 1963 also saw the March on Washington, the largest public demonstration in American history up to that time, where King gave his famous speech, I Have a Dream. King and the other organizers called for a civil rights bill and help for the poor, demanding public works, a higher minimum wage, and an end to discrimination in employment. Which eventually, in one of the great bright spots in American history, did sort of happen with the Civil Rights Act. So one reason American history teachers focus on the civil rights movement so much is that it successfully brought actual legislative change. After being elected president, John F. Kennedy was initially cool to civil rights, but to be fair, the Cold War occupied a lot of his time, what with the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs and whatnot. But the demonstrations of 1963 pushed John F. Kennedy to support civil rights more actively. According to our dear friend, the historian Eric Foner, Kennedy realized that the United States simply could not declare itself the champion of freedom throughout the world while maintaining a system of racial inequality at home. So that June, he appeared on TV and called on Congress to pass a law that would ban discrimination in all public accommodations. And then he was was assassinated. Thanks, Lee Harvey Oswald. Or possibly someone else, but probably Lee Harvey Oswald. So then Lyndon Johnson became president, and he pushed Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The law prohibited discrimination in employment, schools, hospitals, and privately owned public places like restaurants and hotels and theaters, and it also banned discrimination on the basis of sex. The Civil Rights Act was a major moment in American legislative history, but it hardly made the United States a haven of equality. So civil rights leaders continued to push for the enfranchisement of African Americans. After Freedom Summer Workers registered people in Mississippi to vote, King launched a March for Voting Rights in Selma, Alabama in January 1965. And again, television swayed public opinion in favor of the demonstrators. Thank you, TV, for your one and only gift to humanity. Just kidding, Battlestar Galactica. So in 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, which gave the federal government the power to oversee voting in places where discrimination was practiced. In 1965, Congress also passed the Hart-Celler Act, which got rid of national origin quotas and allowed Asian immigrants to immigrate to the United States. Unfortunately, the law also introduced quotas on immigrants from the Western Hemisphere. Lyndon Johnson's domestic initiatives from 1965 through 1967 are known as the Great Society, and it's possible that if he hadn't been responsible for America escalating the war in Vietnam, he might have been remembered, at least by liberals, as one of America's greatest presidents. Because the Great Society expanded a lot of the promises of the New Deal, especially in the creation of health insurance programs like Medicare for the elderly and Medicaid for the poor. He also went to war on poverty. Never go to war with a noun. You will always lose. Johnson treated poverty as a social problem rather than an economic one, so instead of focusing on jobs or guaranteed income, his initiatives stressed things like training. That, unfortunately, failed to take into account shifts in the economy away from high-wage union manufacturing jobs toward more lower-wage service jobs. Here's what Eric Foner had to say about Johnson's domestic accomplishments. By the 1990s, the historic gap between whites and blacks in education, income, and access to skilled employment narrowed considerably. But with deindustrialization and urban decay affecting numerous families and most suburbs still being off limits to non-white people, the median wealth of white households remained 10 times greater than that of African Americans, and nearly a quarter of all black children lived in poverty. While Congress was busy enacting Johnson's Great Society programs, the movement for African American freedom was changing. Let's go to the thought bubble. Persistent poverty and continued discrimination in the workplace, housing, education, and criminal justice system might explain the shift away from integration and toward Black Power, a celebration of African American culture and criticism of white suppression. 1964 saw the beginnings of riots in city ghettos, for instance, mostly in northern cities. The worst riots were in 1965 in Watts, in Southern California. These left 35 people dead, 900 injured, and $30 million in damage. Newark and Detroit also saw devastating riots in 1967. In 1968, the Kerner Report blamed the cause of the rioting on segregation, poverty, and white racism. Then there's Malcolm X, who many white people regarded as an advocate for violence, but who also called for self-reliance. It's tempting to see leadership shifting from King to X as the civil rights movement became more militant, but Malcolm X was active in the early 1960s, and he was killed in 1965, 3 years before Martin Luther King was assassinated and before all the major shifts in emphasis toward Black Power. Older civil rights groups like CORE abandoned integration as a goal after 1965 and started to call for Black Power. The rhetoric of Black Power could be strident, but its message of Black empowerment was deeply resonant for many. Oakland's Black Panther Party did carry guns in self-defense, but they also offered a lot of neighborhood services. But the Black Power movement turned many white people away from the struggle for African American freedom, and by the end of the 1960s, many Americans' attention had shifted to the anti-war movement. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So it was Vietnam that really galvanized students, even though many didn't have to go to Vietnam because they had student deferments. They just really, really didn't want their friends to go. The anti-war movement and the civil rights movement inspired other groups to seek an end to oppression, like Latinos organized to celebrate their heritage and end discrimination. Latino activism was like Black Power, but much more explicitly linked to labor justice, especially the strike efforts led by Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers. The American Indian movement, founded in 1968, took over Alcatraz to symbolize the land that had been taken from Native Americans, and they won greater tribal control over education, economic development, and and they also filed suits for restitution. And in June of 1969, after police raided a gay bar called the Stonewall Inn, members of the gay community began a series of demonstrations in New York City which touched off the modern gay liberation movement. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are pretty simple. I read the mystery document, guess the author, I'm either right or I get shocked. All right, what do we got here? If the Bill of Rights contains no guarantee that a citizen shall be secure against lethal poisons distributed either by private individuals or by public officials, I already know it. It is surely only because of our forefathers, despite their considerable wisdom and foresight, could conceive of no such problem. Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. Yes, I am on such a roll! Silent Spring was a massively important book because it was the first time that anyone really described all of the astonishingly poisonous things we were putting into the air and the ground and the water. Fortunately, that's all been straightened out now, and everything that we do and make as human beings is now sustainable. What's that? Oh God. The environmental movement gained huge bipartisan support, and it resulted in important legislation during the Nixon era, including the Clean Air and Water Acts and the Endangered Species Act. And yes, I said that environmental legislation was passed during the Nixon administration. But perhaps the most significant freedom movement in terms of number of people involved and long-lasting effects was the American feminist movement. This is usually said to have begun with the publication of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, which set out to describe, quote, the problem that has no name. Turns out the name is misogyny. Friedan described a constricting social and economic system that affected mostly middle-class women, but it resonated with the educated classes and led to the foundation of the National Organization of Women in 1966. Participation in student and civil rights movement led many women to identify themselves as members of a group that was systemically discriminated against. And by systemic, I mean that in 1963, 5.8% of doctors were women and 3.7% of lawyers were women, and fewer than 10% of doctoral degrees went to women. They are more than half of the population. While Congress responded with the Equal Pay Act in 1963, younger women sought greater power and autonomy in addition to legislation. Crucially, 60s-era feminists opened America to the idea that the personal is political, especially when it came to equal pay, childcare, and abortion. Weirdly, the branch of government that provided most support to the expansion of personal freedom in the 1960s was the most conservative one, the Supreme Court. The Warren Court handed down so many decisions expanding civil rights that the era has sometimes been called a rights revolution. The Warren Court expanded the protections of free speech and assembly under the First Amendment and freedom of the press in the New York Times versus Sullivan decision. It struck down a law banning interracial marriage in the most appropriately named case ever, Loving versus Virginia. And although this would become a lightning rod for many conservatives, Supreme Court decisions greatly expanded the protections of people accused of crimes. Gideon versus Wainwright secured the right to an attorney. Mapp versus Ohio established the exclusionary rule under the Fourth Amendment, and Miranda versus Arizona provided fodder for Channing Tatum in his great movie 21 Jump Street, ensuring that he would always have to say to every perp, "You have the right to remain silent. But you can't silence my heart, Channing Tatum. It beats only for thee." But the most innovative and controversial decisions actually established a new right where none had existed in the Constitution. Griswold versus Connecticut dealt with contraception, and Roe v. Wade guaranteed a woman's right to an abortion at least in the first trimester, and those two decisions formed the basis of a new right, the right to privacy. Protests, the counterculture, and the liberation movements continued well into the 1970s, losing steam with the end of the Vietnam War and America's economy plunging into the toilet. For many, though, the year 1968 sums up the decade. 1968 began with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which stirred up the anti-war protests. Then, racial violence erupted after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th, 1968. Then, anti-war demonstrators, as well as some counterculture types, arrived in large numbers at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, where they were set upon by police and beaten in what was later described as a police riot. 1968 also saw the Prague Spring Uprising in Czechoslovakia crushed by the Soviets, and student demonstrators were killed by the police in Mexico City, where the Olympics were held, and Parisian students took to the streets in widespread protests against, France. All this unrest scared a lot of people who ended up voting for Richard Nixon and his promises to return to law and order. Ultimately, Honestly, like any decade or arbitrary historical age, the 60s defies easy categorization. Yes, there were hippies and liberation movements, but there were also reactions to those movements. On this one, I'm just going to leave it up to Eric Foner to summarize the decade's legacy. The 1960s made possible the entrance of numerous members of racial minorities into the mainstream of American life while leaving unsolved the problem of urban poverty. It set in motion a transformation of the status of women. It changed what Americans expected from their government, from clean air and water to medical coverage in old age. And at the same time, it undermined confidence in national leaders. Relations between young and old, men and women, and white and non-white, along with every institution in society, changed as a result. But there's one last thing I want to emphasize. All of this wasn't really the result of like a radical revolution. It was the result of a process that had been going on for decades. I mean, arguably a process that had been going on for hundreds of years. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is made with the help of all of these nice people, and it's possible because of generous support from the Bluth Family Frozen Banana Stand. Just kidding, we don't have corporate sponsors. We have you. Subbable.com is a voluntary subscription platform, by the way, you can just click on my face, that allows people who care about stuff, like you hopefully care about Crash Course, to support it directly on a monthly basis. I'm over here now, but you should still click on my face. So Subbable has lots of great Crash Course perks. You can get signed posters and all kinds of things, and most importantly, you can help us keep this show free forever for everyone. Thank you again for watching, and as we say in my hometown, there's always money in the banana stand.
Hi, I'm Clint Smith, and this is Crash Course Black American History. And today, we're going back to the courtroom. If you've been watching this series, it's probably starting to feel like a pretty familiar place, because a lot of history has played out here. While many Black Americans were being kept from voting because of domestic terrorism and Jim Crow laws, the courtroom became a place where unfair practices could be challenged. Today, we're going to talk about one of the most important cases in U.S. history, the Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education. Let's start the show. Because Black people often didn't have representation in their state or congressional bodies, it sometimes made changing laws through legislation difficult. But the courts were one avenue through which Black Americans were able to fight for their citizenship rights and feel like they had a chance. When the Constitution was amended to include the Reconstruction Amendments, aka the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, Black Americans were formally made citizens of the United States. And citizenship is important because it affirms that you have access to rights and resources in your country. But many white Americans weren't okay with Black Americans becoming citizens. They benefited from Black Americans not having the same protections and resources that they did. And so white Americans created Jim Crow laws that implemented segregation and hindered Black Americans' right to vote. We'll talk more about the civil rights movement and the fight to vote in a few more episodes. But segregation is an important place to start. Segregation wasn't just morally bad, but also discreetly, or maybe not so discreetly, assured that Black Americans wouldn't be able to access all of the practical and material benefits of their citizenship. And this sets the stage for Brown v. Board of Education. Access to public school education was definitely one of those citizenship rights that Black Americans were entitled to. But white Americans used Jim Crow laws and the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, which stated that separate but equal schools made segregation okay, to justify keeping the races separate. But the reality was that separate was rarely equal. Many schools for Black students were severely underfunded, had outdated materials, and were just generally dilapidated. Schools for white students, on the other hand, often had drastically better resources. The injustice was clear, and Black Americans started organizing to get their Black students the education and resources that they deserved. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had their eyes on the issue of school segregation way back in the 1930s, when they commissioned the Margold Report. The report ran over 200 pages, and half of them dealt directly with segregation in schools. During that time, the NAACP had some small victories for equal education in public colleges and universities, but when it came to elementary and secondary schools, segregationists just wouldn't budge. But Brown v. Board of Education happened in the 1950s. So why are we talking about the 1930s? Well, things in the courts can take a long time, and the NAACP was playing the long game. The execution of their plan took about 20 years, starting with the leadership of Charles Hamilton Houston, a Harvard graduate and the director of the NAACP's legal strategy, and ending with the legal prowess of his mentee, Thurgood Marshall. In 1952, the NAACP brought 5 different cases on school segregation from different states: South Carolina, Virginia, Kansas, Delaware, and the District of Columbia. The NAACP's lawyers presented legal arguments on how unconstitutional segregation and separate but equal were. These 5 cases were combined into Brown v. Board of Education and went to the Supreme Court in 1953. Let's go to the thought bubble. Oliver Brown was an assistant pastor who lived in an integrated neighborhood in Topeka, Kansas. In September of 1950, Oliver Brown went to his local elementary school, the Sumner School, and tried to enroll his daughter, Linda. The principal said that she would not be allowed to attend because she was Black, and the school did not accept Black students. The principal also said that state laws allowed for segregation. So basically, sorry, not sorry. Since Linda couldn't go to her local school, which was only a few blocks away from her home, she had to attend the all-Black school, but it involved a 2-hour commute via bus and car. This led to a very sleepy Linda Brown and a very upset Oliver Brown. Different historians will tell you different things about what happened next. Some say that Brown went to the NAACP and became part of the lawsuit. Others say that the entire act of going to the local school in the first place was at the NAACP's urging. Either way, while there were eventually 12 other plaintiffs as part of the NAACP's case, Oliver Brown, on behalf of his daughter, became its lead plaintiff. And even though we associate the Brown name with desegregation, Linda Brown was never actually able to attend the Sumner School, because by the time the ruling was handed down, she was in junior high. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Thurgood Marshall was the chief attorney for the plaintiffs. Marshall was a victim of, but also a victor over, segregated education himself. After graduating with honors from Lincoln University, he was unable to attend the University of Maryland Law School because he wasn't white. Undeterred, he attended Howard University School of Law instead, which had become the first black law school in the nation in 1869. He graduated first in his class. He later went on to become the head of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. And ultimately, he would be appointed by Lyndon B. Johnson as the first black American Supreme Court justice. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Back to Marshall's NAACP days. Marshall and his team argued before the Supreme Court that segregated schools were unconstitutional and that separate but equal had to go. And the court finally agreed with them. And on May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously held that segregated public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause. In his decision, Chief Justice Earl Warren said, quote, "We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, we hold that the plaintiffs and others similarly situated for whom the actions have been brought are, by reason of the segregation complained of, deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment." This was a huge victory for Black Americans, but enforcing the ruling was a different story. After Brown v. Board overturned separate but equal in schools, riots and violence erupted all over the country. White protesters terrorized Black communities throughout the South, especially in South Carolina, Georgia, and Mississippi. In Texas and Florida, white vigilante groups burned crosses to terrorize Black residents. Some scholars have argued that even though a budding civil rights movement propelled Brown v. Board to victory, the backlash against the case accelerated the civil rights movement as Black Americans were increasingly harassed and abused by angry segregationists. Some school districts even decided to close all of their schools rather than allowing Black children to integrate them. For example, in 1959, the Prince Edward County School System of Virginia completely shut down so that white students didn't have to go to school with Black students. Many white parents sent their children to segregated private schools, and Black children either had to go to school in another county, which was just unfeasible for so many families, or not go to school at all. And it wasn't until 1964, in another unanimous Supreme Court case, Griffin v. County School Board of Prince Edward County, that the Prince Edward County schools reopened. Some Black children missed out on 5 years of their education. 5 years. So while it would be easy to look at Brown v. Board as an example of America changing for the better, and the Supreme Court doing what's right simply because it was right, it's also important to look at the broader context that animated that decision. At this time, tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union were at their peak, and the Cold War was an omnipresent force in both American and global politics. Many top officials in the U.S. government, including justices on the Supreme Court, were acutely cognizant of how segregation and images of violence and terror enacted against Black people harmed the United States' reputation and their ability to say that American democracy was the greatest in the world. Chief Justice Earl Warren said in a 1954 speech to the American Bar Association that our American system, like all others, is on trial both at home and abroad. The extent to which we maintain the spirit of our Constitution, with its Bill of Rights, will in the long run do more to make it both secure and the object of adulation than the number of hydrogen bombs we stockpile. So while it was about black children's right to an education, it also was about much more than that. Just think about it. Jim Crow was so deeply entrenched in American society that people would rather shut down an entire school system for years rather than allow black children to attend. Essentially, Jim Crow and separate but equal policies were used to diminish the quality of the black American citizenship experience. We all know that a quality education can improve economic outcomes. So when so many black Americans were prevented from having access to the resources they needed for a quality education, it perpetuated the community's economic despair. What's more, Brown v. Board also had some pretty drastic unintended consequences. As the ruling was being implemented across the country, tens of thousands of black teachers and principals lost their jobs. Black children were now beginning to attend white schools, but those white schools didn't want black teachers. The idea of a black teacher or principal being in a position of authority over white students was just a non-starter for many white parents. Another unsettling part about this is that while Brown v. Board attempted to get rid of segregation in American schools because of policy decisions around education, housing, and zoning, the sad truth is that schools today are as segregated as they were in the late 1960s. Clearly, there's still a lot of work to do. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Crash Course is made with the help of all these nice people, and our animation team is Thought Cafe. Crash Course is possible with the help of all the people who bought the 2021 Crash Course Learner Coin and by all our patrons on Patreon. Thank you to all our patrons and supporters for making Crash Course possible.
"19 years after Chinese soldiers and airmen sprang a winter surprise on U.S. and Allied forces in the Korean War, China stood up to the world's second superpower from March 2, 1969, until September 11th of that same year. Troop buildups and skirmishes erupted sporadically over the disputed border along the frozen Ussuri River in Siberia, prompting Chairman Mao to proclaim in the People's Daily newspaper that the Russians were attempting to create an anti-China ring of encirclement. In a compounding sequence of actions and reactions, both sides amassed a large military presence along the disputed border, which peaked at 658,000 Soviet soldiers against 814,000 lesser-trained combatants on the Chinese side. Mao threatened the Soviets with a massive people's war, while years later, high-ranking Russian defector Arkady Shevchenko reported that the Soviet Supreme Leader Leonid Brezhnev and the Politburo were terrified about a nightmare vision of invasion by millions of Chinese. The undeclared border war started in March when a group of People's Liberation Army soldiers ambushed Soviet border guards at Zhenbeo Island, causing the loss of 248 Chinese soldiers, as well as 58 deaths on the Soviet side. Sporadic engagements would take place over the next 6 months, until an edgy peace was established through diplomatic negotiations. But the real threat of the Sino-Soviet border war was just how close it came to a nuclear tragedy. While the Soviets at the time had a nuclear arsenal of some 10,000 warheads, China had but a handful of nuclear warheads only, minus any form of delivery vehicle, which effectively made them a non-nuclear power. As late as November of 1968, Mao himself admitted that China could not be counted as a nuclear country, leaving them no other options but to fight a war with conventional weapons. Soviet military leaders, on the other hand, believed that a preemptive nuclear strike was the only way to end China's growing threat, obliging the Soviet Union to go so far as to approach the Nixon administration to gauge how the U.S. would react if the Soviets aimed their missiles at Beijing and other strategic targets. As then U.S. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger later reflected, the Soviet Union was much closer to a preemptive nuclear attack than we realized at the time. The Soviet Union stood down from their planned nuclear offensive only after Washington warned Moscow that they would not stand idly by if the Soviets chose a nuclear option. While the situation cooled by September of 1969, the ongoing border dispute would not see a lasting resolution until a series of agreements were penned as late as 2004, giving China several hundred disputed islands along 3 rivers in a largely unproductive yet vital waterway in Siberia. And there you have it, the almost nuclear war of 1969. Today on the Daily Dose.
There are too many places occupied by the Soviet Union. The Russians took everything they could. We have not yet presented a count of this list. Under the Tsars, the Russians took from the Chinese sphere of influence territory exceeding U.S. east of the Mississippi. Think the Chinese didn't notice? Yes, they noticed. But Mao has other gripes against the Russians. Stalin, in the lead up to World War II, had made sure to set up the Chinese to fight Japan so that he wouldn't have to. So that leaves him just fighting Nazis, not Nazis and Japanese. And then Stalin takes Mongolia, which had formerly been a part of the Chinese sphere of influence. And in the Korean War, he's more than happy to fight to the last Chinese. And then during the Chinese Civil War, the Russians tell Mao, oh, stop, Yangtze, you need to take a little breather here. Because he wants a divided China, like the divided Germany he has, and then the divided Korea he's going to get. You want to be surrounded by these little broken states around you if you're a continental power. So it's not surprising that the Sino-Soviet border war of 1969 breaks out during the Vietnam War. And the Russians come to us, the Americans, and say, is it okay if we nuke these people? And the United States says, no, there's no way it's okay to nuke these people. And Mao figures it out. The one that wants to nuke you, that's the primary adversary. So prior to that moment, the United States is the primary adversary of both Russia and China. Now with this, they're primary adversaries of each other. And this gives the United States a swing position of team up with A or team up with B. And the United States teamed up with China to overextend Russia in the Cold War because it always felt that the Soviets were the bigger threat in those days.
This is Space Conquerors Park, a few hundred miles south of Moscow. It's a celebration of Russia's achievements in space exploration. And the reason the park was built here is that 60 years ago, this place became part of a remarkable story. On the 12th of April, 1961, a Soviet Air Force pilot, Yuri Gagarin, became the first human to blast into space. And on his descent, Gagarin parachuted out of the tiny space capsule he was in, and he landed here. This was farmland at the time, much to the surprise of a 5-year-old girl who was out in the fields planting potatoes.
Бабушка делала луночки, а я просто помогала, бросала картошечку в лунки. Через некоторое время я обернулась в поле и увидела что-то оранжевое, красивое, непонятно что. И шел к нам навстречу. Бабушка испугалась. Бабушка испугалась, схватила меня за руку, и мы хотели убежать в сторону дома. Говорит, мамаша, стойте, я свой. Я бабушке сказала: остановись, послушай, говорит по-русски, человек, наверное.
What do you remember most about this spaceman who was suddenly standing in front of you?
Конечно, улыбка. Улыбка. И голос такой добрый. Бабушка спросила: откуда ты, на чем, как сюда попал вообще на поле? Он говорит: я на корабле. Она ему сказала: тут воды-то близко нету, какой корабль? Он говорит: я с неба.
Раскрывай объятия столицы.
The next call was at Admiralty House to see the Prime Minister. Mr. Macmillan said, he's a delightful fellow, which just about sums up what everybody thought.
How does it feel to have been part of history?
Я считаю, что в жизни мне очень повезло, что я оказалась первой, что я оказалась на этом поле, сажала картошку с бабушкой. И я очень горжусь тем, что именно наш советский космонавт спустился к нам с небес на наше поле.
Hundreds of people have since travelled into space, but only one man was first. And Russians are intensely proud of the fact that it was their guy, Yuri Gagarin, who made history with his flight to the stars.
In April 1961, more than 1,000 Cuban exiles stormed the beaches at the Bay of Pigs to launch a revolt against Fidel Castro. Castro rose to power in the 1950s after years of training with his guerrilla army. On New Year's Day, 1959, Castro and his army invaded Havana, forcing US-backed leader Fulgencio Batista to flee the country. Castro declared himself prime minister and took control of the nation.
They surrounded him, engulfed him, clutched and clawed him. Fidel, our liberator, they roared. Fidel, our savior. It was January 1959.
With Castro in power, the relationship between the US and Cuba shifted dramatically. Castro signed a deal agreeing to buy oil from the Soviet Union. However, US-owned refineries in Cuba refused to process the Soviet oil.
Mikoyan also promised that the Soviet Union would ship crude oil to Cuba. American, British, and Dutch companies, which had drilled wells and built refineries in Cuba, refused to process the crude oil. Denouncing the foreign plutocrats who would impede the liberation of colonized people, Castro seized the oil companies.
The US then severed all diplomatic relations with Cuba. Within a year, Castro declared himself a communist, established a formal alliance with the Soviet Union, and took control of the remaining assets owned by Americans and foreign entities.
The Cuban premier completed his nationalization of an estimated $1 billion in United States-owned property.
With a communist state sitting just 90 miles from the coast of Florida, President Dwight D. Eisenhower had to take action. He authorized the CIA to conduct a covert operation to cleanse Cuba of their new regime. The plan was simple: recruit Cuban exiles who lived in Miami to infiltrate the island and start an uprising. When the Kennedy administration took over, all signs pointed to the invasion being a massive success, but it wasn't. The inevitable failure began with the recruits. When Castro ascended to power, thousands of Cubans fled to Miami. To the CIA, these weren't refugees. They were future capitalist freedom fighters. Brigade 2506 was born. The recruits were trained in the art of guerrilla warfare. Some even had flying experience. But despite the extensive training, there was still one small problem: spies. Among the recruits were several double agents working for Castro. The plan was to start 2 days before the ground invasion, with exiled Cuban pilots infiltrating the Air Force and sabotaging Castro's air power from the inside. Then, the invasion forces would land in the old city of Trinidad because of its anti-communist beliefs and port facilities. But as the operation drew nearer, Kennedy called an audible. Nervous about the integrity of the plan's operational security, Kennedy moved the landing to the Bay of Pigs. The decision was a bit of a head-scratcher. Besides being one of Castro's favorite vacation spots, the bay was surrounded by swampland that would make it extremely difficult for locals to join the revolt. Despite the uncertainty, on April 15th, it was go time. Exiled Cuban pilots flew B-26 bombers, taking off from Nicaragua, and eliminated approximately 80% of Castro's combat aircraft inventory. Castro didn't believe that these pilots were members of his Air Force. He blamed the US and predicted that something much bigger was brewing. Castro ordered the population to seek shelter and lock themselves away to squash the possibility of an uprising.
In Cuba, charging the United States with arming and training mercenary forces for an imminent invasion. He calls out some 200,000 militiamen for training and guard duty.
After the bombing, Cuba's foreign minister called an emergency meeting of the United Nations.
Taking its case to the United Nations, Cuba seeks to put the United States on trial, charging his nation has been invaded by what he terms mercenaries from Guatemala and Florida.
Adlai Stevenson, U.S. ambassador to the UN, claimed the U.S. had no involvement in the attacks. Because nobody told him.
These charges are totally false, and I deny them categorically.
After lying to the UN, the U.S. walked a razor's edge. Kennedy canceled the rest of the airstrikes, but the ground invasion was to continue as planned. On the morning of April 17th, Brigade 2506 sailed toward the shore for their long-awaited homecoming. But things did not start off well. The ocean claimed a large amount of weapons and other equipment. When they reached the shore, they were met by roughly 20,000 Cuban armed forces, supported by the remaining combat aircraft that were spared the day prior. As Castro sank their ships and depleted their men, Brigade 2506 spiraled toward an epic defeat. Paratroopers missed targets, lost equipment, and suffered injuries. A few managed to barricade roads and hold their positions for 2 days. On April 19th, Kennedy authorized air support from 6 unmarked U.S. fighter planes. But they arrived an hour late due to the time change. The planes were shot down. Failure was inevitable. In the end, approximately 1,200 members of Brigade 2506 were captured, and about 100 were killed. Kennedy had to answer for his mistakes, and a settlement was reached to free the prisoners, $53 million worth of baby food. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion was a significant setback for the U.S. It was a massive blow to Kennedy's credibility and undermined his leadership in the eyes of many Americans and the world, making it difficult for him to pursue his policy objectives. The event also emboldened Castro and the Soviet Union, leading to increased tensions during the Cold War.
Friends, relatives, and companions of the ill-fated landing at the Bay of Pigs are reunited with the men.
Celebrations in Germany to mark an anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. After the end of the Second World War, this city became the front line for a different kind of war, the Cold War. For nearly 40 years, Europe was divided between the democracies of the West and the communist states of the East, and Berlin was where the two sides met. When Nazi Germany was defeated in 1945, Berlin was divided up into 4 parts by the Allied powers and the Soviet Union. As post-war Germany started to rebuild, 2 countries were formed from the rubble: a a free market and democratic West Germany and a communist-controlled East Germany under the influence of Russia. Despite growing tensions between West and East Berlin, Berliners were able to move between the two halves of the city to go to work, school or visit family and friends, until one night in August 1961. Overnight, East German soldiers sealed off the border between the two halves of the city.
I watched workmen supervised by troops putting the finishing touches to the cement curtain through which no East German can pass.
The first and main shock we had was 61, when they built a wall right through a city. It was not an ordinary wall around a city to protect it from enemies, but it was a prison wall through a city. And we didn't believe this. We thought there is a responsibility of all the four allies, and they will hold this city together. But nobody did anything.
Boyfriends and girlfriends, parents and children, whole families suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of the wall. Even streets became divided.
The wall divided the street. So, for example, a young man and a young girl who loved each other couldn't see each other anymore when the wall was built, because the wall was built exactly at the street. And neighbors, families, they could see each other, but they couldn't go to each other because the wall divided the street. And I think this is a symbol for divided Berlin, for divided Europe, and for divided world at that time.
Houses along the border were bricked up. People made desperate bids to escape across the border into the West. Some even died trying. Teenager Peter Fechter was the first to lose his life, shot by border guards.
We saw Peter Fechter bleeding and nobody helped him. He was right in front of the American soldiers. Nobody helped him. It was on the other side of the world. And it was a question of war and Cold War. Not peace, but Cold War was better than war.
Over the next few years, the authorities strengthened the barriers and it became known as the Berlin Wall.
You can see the first barrier where after the graveyard. After this there was electric fence, but if you touched it, you had no idea what happened if you are somebody who wants to flee. But the soldiers in the watchtower, they got a signal that there is somebody. And then came the inner wall, which was not so high. And behind this inner wall, there was something like on the floor with needles on it. So if you jumped over the inner wall, you landed in needles, 10 centimeter high needles. Then the original death strip with bunkers and soldiers, they got permittance from their system, from the government, to shoot to everybody who is near there.
As the Berlin Wall became harder to cross, people came up with more and more ambitious ideas to help friends and families escape from East Berlin. This house is where one of the most dramatic escapes took place. A group of students from the West spent months building a tunnel 135 meters long under the wall and into the cellar of this house in East Berlin.
Nicht jeder konnte in solche enge Röhre reinkriechen, denn manche sagten, wir würden gerne helfen, wir machen auch sehr gerne schwere
Not everyone was able to crawl into such a tight tunnel. Some said, we would like to help, we're happy to do hard labour, but we can't enter such a tight tunnel, especially not as we know that we'll be under East German territory, and our thoughts would focus on what would happen if the tunnel would be discovered or we would be trapped.
An den Seiten lagen also auch Tunnelgräber, oder saßen.
People who dug the tunnel lay on both sides. They calmed the refugees down. Stay calm, they said, to avoid panic, and they passed my baby along. We had to crawl on all fours. It might have been possible to do this on your own, but it was calming. And we crawled for 135 or 136 meters and climbed up the stairs. Then I fainted for the first and last time in my life. Then my child arrived and the whole situation was totally exceptional.
Kam auch gleich das Kind und dann hatte man war auch so in Ausnahmesituation.
This is a special report from CBS News. Good evening, this is Walter Cronkite at CBS News headquarters in New York. Well, at its beginning, this day looked as though it might be one of armed conflict between Soviet vessels and American warships on the sea lanes leading to Cuba.
October 22nd, 1962. U.S. President John F. Kennedy deploys a fleet of warships to Cuba to intercept Soviet cargo ships, which are already on the way, transporting nuclear missiles to the island. Kennedy strategically called the impending showdown
A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment.
What it really was a blockade, which is an act of aggression. One wrong move on either side could trigger an all-out nuclear war. And it all started here, a week earlier, with an aerial photograph that doesn't seem to show much unless you're looking for something specific. Pretty much immediately following the Allied victory in World War II, the United States and Soviet Union became bitter enemies, kicking off a decades-long struggle for global influence known as the Cold War. Espionage and intelligence were at the center of this conflict, most crucially surrounding the mutual buildup of nuclear arsenals capable of unprecedented levels of destruction. But the US initially had a hard time keeping track of their nemesis. The Soviet Union was notoriously secretive and hid itself and its actions from the world.
An iron curtain has descended across the continent. Nobody knows what Soviet Russia intends to do in the immediate future.
Then U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower saw a solution that built on experimental intelligence gathering from World War II, aerial photo analysis. In the late 1950s, the new high-altitude U-2 spy plane took photo reconnaissance to the next level. It was equipped with a powerful camera and could fly at a staggering height of 70,000 feet, or roughly 13 miles above Earth's surface.
These cameras are described as capable of spotting a golf ball on a putting green from 40,000 feet.
In 1961, Eisenhower authorized the creation of a new surveillance arm of the CIA, the National Photographic Interpretation Center, or NPIC. This small team of photo interpreters was trained in photogrammetry, the science of determining measurements from photographs. Using this method, an expert photo interpreter could identify specific equipment hidden in the tiny details of photographs and recognize signs of nuclear missile site construction. So what's all this got to do with Cuba? After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, where the US attempted to overthrow Cuba's communist government, ties between the Soviet Union and Cuba strengthened. The US worried that the Soviets might use Cuba as a nuclear missile base. If so, they would suddenly have the Western Hemisphere within range of nuclear weapons. The CIA began flying U-2 missions over Cuba and bringing the imagery to the NPIC, whose photo interpreters pored over every detail, searching for evidence of Soviet presence on the island. It was like looking for a needle in a mile-long haystack. That's how much film a single U-2 mission yields, covering huge amounts of land. But on October 15, 1962, Dino Brugioni, a senior photo interpreter, found something. This photo proved beyond doubt that the Soviets were building nuclear missile sites in Cuba. Brugioni identified military tents and trucks arranged in known Soviet patterns, launcher equipment, and, most critically, missile transport trailers measuring 65 feet in length, which, when compared to a photo that was taken in Moscow, made it a perfect match for the Soviet SS-4, which had a range of 1,100 nautical miles, meaning American cities as far as Washington, D.C. would be in reach. When the MPIC briefed Kennedy on what they'd found, the president ordered a scaling up of U-2 missions to photograph and analyze all of Cuba. Photo analysts updated Kennedy daily and in secret on their progress, which gave him time to decide how to confront the Soviet Union. Given the evidence, Kennedy was strongly advised to launch airstrikes against the missile sites and invade Cuba. But he took a more measured approach with his
strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment,
which kicked off 6 intense days between the US and the Soviet Union, with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev calling Kennedy's move an act of aggression that pushes mankind to the abyss of world nuclear missile war.
Round-the-clock processing of their film shows that work on the missile sites is being accelerated.
The damning photos were revealed to allies at the United Nations as the US military rapidly mobilized and was placed on high alert, and Cuba prepared for another invasion. But when Soviet freighters reached the quarantine line,
A Soviet chartered vessel, the Marukla, is stopped, boarded, and inspected, then cleared to proceed to Cuba. Apparently, the Soviet vessels loaded with offensive weapons have turned back.
a few days later, Kennedy received a message from Khrushchev. The Soviet Union had agreed to withdraw from Cuba in exchange for the US removing missiles it had placed in Turkey and Italy. So, the nuclear missile sites were dismantled and the Soviets left, transporting their nuclear missiles with them back across the Iron Curtain. In a personal thank you letter to the MPIC, Kennedy emphasized the importance of the analysis and interpretation of the Cuban photography in advising the US's response in what is now called the Cuban Missile Crisis.
In summary, the Soviet Union did embark upon a bold venture to establish clandestinely in the Western Hemisphere a major offensive weapons base. That they were deterred in this effort is in large part attributable to the type of reconnaissance photography that we have just reviewed.
In 1962, the Cold War was heating up in America's backyard. Since aligning himself with the Soviet Union, Cuban dictator Fidel Castro was an object of growing U.S. concern. A failed attempt to oust him from power in April 1961 through the use of Cuban exile forces emboldened both Castro and his Kremlin supporters. In May 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev offered to install offensive nuclear weapons in Cuba. Castro readily agreed, viewing the missiles as a deterrent against another U.S. attempt to force him from power. Missiles began to arrive that summer under the tightest secrecy. Khrushchev's plan depended on getting the missiles operational before the Americans discovered they were there. But U.S. intelligence quickly learned that something unusual was afoot on the island nation. In early October, U-2 and Navy reconnaissance flights provided alarming but conclusive evidence that the Soviets were constructing missile launch sites throughout Cuba. President Kennedy immediately assembled his national security team, including military members of the Joint Staff, to determine a course of action. After several days in which all the options were weighed, the administration announced a strict naval quarantine of Cuba, in which U.S. Navy ships would prevent any further offensive military weapons from being delivered to Cuba.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
While this policy was deemed less risky than a full-scale strike against Cuba, it was not without risk. A blockade was, after all, an act of war. But by calling it a quarantine and limiting it to offensive military weapons, the U.S. gained support from key Allied governments. It looks like it's up to the Navy, Kennedy said to Chief of Naval Operations Admiral George W. Anderson. Mr. President, the Navy will not let you down, Anderson replied. Indeed, the burden fell squarely on the U.S. Navy. Naval forces under U.S. Atlantic Command, headed by Admiral Robert L. Dennison, steamed out to sea, intercepting not only merchant shipping en route to Cuba, but Soviet submarines operating in the area as well. One of the first destroyers on the scene, USS Blandy, diligently tracked a Soviet Foxtrot submarine, eventually forcing it to surface. We now know these submarines were carrying nuclear-tipped torpedoes and were the spearhead of a Soviet effort to establish a naval base on Cuba. U.S. destroyers maintained the quarantine. Radar picket ships, supported by Navy fighters and airborne early warning planes, assisted the U.S. Air Force's Air Defense Command in preparing to defend American airspace from Soviet and Cuban forces. The aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and Marine forces of the Second Fleet under Vice Admiral Alfred G. Ward were poised to launch air, naval gunfire, and amphibious strikes against Soviet and Cuban forces ashore if the quarantine failed. For 13 days in late October, the world held its breath.
This is Radio Moscow. Premier Khrushchev has sent a message to President Kennedy today. The Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
The Soviet ships turned back. The crisis was over. Khrushchev, faced with the armed might of the United States and its allies, had little choice but to find some way out of the difficult situation in which he had placed himself and his country. President Kennedy did not press the advantage that the strength of U.S. and Allied naval and military forces gave him. That allowed the Soviet leader to peacefully disengage his nation from this most serious of confrontations. For the rest of the Cold War, the U.S. and Soviet Union never again reached the brink of what would have been a world-altering nuclear conflict. The lesson is clear. The U.S. Navy has kept the sea free for over 200 years. The Navy not only protected America in 1962, it continues to provide a potent deterrent to any force that threatens peace today.
And cover. Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover. Paul and Patty know this. No matter where they go or what they do, they always try to remember what to do if the atom bomb explodes right then. It's a bomb. Duck and cover. Sundays, holidays, vacation time, we must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes. Duck and cover. That's the first thing to do. Duck and cover. First, you duck. And then, you cover. You duck and cover tight. Duck and cover under the table. It's a bomb. Duck and cover.
He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you. Duck and cover.
tell me. Don't forget to duck.
Wow, this is so cool. And actually pretty large by the standards of fallout shelters.
At the time, yes. This one's actually 14 feet long by 6.5 feet tall. And it's actually made out of boiler steel. And then that way it's very strong and it's worthy of anything such as shock waves or whatever. Up to 8 people can stay in this chamber alone, but you notice there's only 4 beds, so you would shift back and forth between sleeping and staying awake. But it also has everything you need. It's got its own fresh water supply, it's got its own system for if you need to use the bathroom facilities or whatever. And so you're all safe and comfy in here until the fallout is done.
Okay, so if this is so secure and safe, and we're underground, of course, how would someone be able to breathe and get fresh air?
Ah, that's a good point. Right over here we have an air pump that would actually pull air through 6 radiation filters, and when it comes in here, it can completely change the air in this chamber in just 7 minutes. So you're always going to have fresh air. If the power should go out, it also has a handle on that, so you can crank it, it becomes a generator and an air pump. So you never have to worry about being without lights or air.
Well, Dana, I know that in the process of doing some research about this fallout shelter, you made a really interesting discovery of the company that actually made this.
Yes, I was very shocked to find out that this is actually an Amway bomb shelter from Amway right out there in Grand Rapids.
Really?
Yes, Dick DeVos and Jay Van Andel actually have the company that built this. I was very shocked.
That's really interesting. You know, not every house can say that they have their own fallout shelter, but of course, here we are inside one. It's off limits right here at a home in Edmore.
This house was 6,000 feet from ground zero. Other homes that were closer were incinerated.
Everybody has seen that very famous footage of the houses just imploding and then exploding out. What happens first is that it gets hit by the heat, and so it blistered almost all of the paint. When you look on the back side of the house, you can still see some remnants of the paint. It ripped all the gutters off of the house. The chimney here was shifted about 6 inches. The blinds that were on the windows were all blown out. But otherwise, this house withstood the blast pressures and the heat from the nuclear test.
The Apple II bomb was placed in a tower 1,500 feet above the ground, so the resulting fireball wouldn't destroy monitoring equipment. Technicians built small towns within the blast zone. Shops, gas stations, dozens of homes made of brick and wood. They called the small cities Doom Towns.
Here, just before dawn, for the first time in our history, American homes will be exposed to atomic blast. Today, Main Street of every American city and town.
We had all kinds of houses built, grocery stores, we had the electrical systems.
Single-story homes, two-story homes, wooden, brick, block, and so on. Different distances from the ground zero to see what the effects would be from the blast and the heat.
Inside the buildings, workers positioned entire families of mannequins who silently waited for the explosions to come.
Let's see what would happen to a normal, average family.
We had mannequins with all different types of clothing on, wool, cotton, rayon, nylon. The mannequins had a house at roughly 5,000 feet away. I had them sitting at the kitchen table, and we had a lean-to in the basement.
The mannequins became some of the most famous participants of the tests.
Those mannequins that had radiation content, they never got them back, but the rest of them that didn't, they took them back. What they did with them, I don't know.
Scenes typical of the American family at home. First floor living room. Children at play, unaware of approaching disaster.
What would happen if there was a full-scale nuclear war between Russia and the United States? Based on non-classified data, the aftermath might go something like this. When one side launches nuclear missiles, the other side detects them and fires back before impact. U.S. submarine-launched ballistic missiles from west of Norway start striking Russia after about 10 minutes. And Russian ones from north of Canada start hitting the U.S. a few minutes later. The very first strikes are high-altitude EMP attacks, frying electronics and power grids by creating an electromagnetic pulse of tens of thousands of volts per meter. The next strikes target command and control, as well as nuclear launch facilities. Land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles take about half an hour to arrive. Major cities are targeted, both because they contain military facilities and to stymie the enemy's post-war recovery. Some cruise missiles take hours to reach their target. Each impact creates a fireball about as hot as the core of the sun, followed by a radioactive mushroom cloud. These intense explosions vaporize people nearby and cause fires and blindness further away. The fireball expansion then causes a blast wave that damages buildings, crushing nearby ones. The United Kingdom and France have nuclear capabilities and are obliged by NATO's Article 5 to defend the US. So Russia hits them too. Firestorms engulf many cities, where storm-level winds fan the flames, igniting anything that can burn, melting glass and some metals, and turning asphalt into flammable hot liquid. But the explosions, the electromagnetic pulse, and the radioactivity aren't the worst part. nuclear winter is, caused by the black carbon smoke from the nuclear firestorms. The Hiroshima atomic bomb caused such a firestorm, but today's hydrogen bombs are much more powerful. A large city like Moscow, with almost 50 times more people, can create much more smoke. And a firestorm sends plumes of black smoke up into the stratosphere, far above any rain clouds that would otherwise wash out the smoke. This black smoke gets heated by sunlight, lofting it like a hot air balloon for up to a decade. High-altitude jet streams are so fast that it takes only a few days for the smoke to spread across much of the northern hemisphere. In the meantime, Earth gets freezing cold, even during the summer, with farmland in Kansas cooling by about 20 degrees centigrade or 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and other regions cooling almost twice as much. A recent scientific paper estimates that over 5 billion people could starve to death, including around 99% of those in the United States, Europe, Russia, and China. We obviously don't know how many people will survive a nuclear war. But if it's even remotely as bad as scientists think, then it has no winners, merely losers. It's easy to feel powerless, but the good news is that there is something you can do to help. Please share this video, because the more people know about nuclear war, the less likely it is that we'll start one.
Look on top of that truck. That's a nuclear warhead. We're going to show you what would happen if even just one tactical nuke was used today. This scenario is not fiction. This story is precise, derived from interviews with military officials and nuclear scientists who say we're speeding towards the next nuclear arms race. Just minutes after launch, the nuke is traveling at blistering speeds. Within a millisecond of detonation, the weapon's plutonium core converts into ionized gas in electromagnetic waves. Everyone in range is briefly blinded. Then comes the roar of 9,000 tons of TNT. Almost instantaneously, a massive fireball blooms. It's hotter than the surface of the sun. On the ground, nearly everything flammable ignites. For miles, the inferno rages, consuming so much oxygen that anyone nearby suffocates. Then comes the blast wave. Then, darkness. Taking a breath is difficult. What still lives spits out mouthfuls of dust and glass fragments, only to breathe in more. No help is on the way. Medical workers in the immediate area are dead or injured. It will be days before outside rescue workers can venture safely into the affected areas. Then, radiation sickness, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Days or weeks after exposure, people who look fine suddenly lose chunks of hair, become anemic and weak, and begin bleeding internally. Their immune systems start to fail, making them helpless against the infectious diseases that have begun to spread. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera. The debris, along with the soot from the raging fires, begins to settle back to Earth. Thick black water droplets, laced with radioactive material, fall from the sky, staining nearly everything they touch. The immediate toll of this one warhead, thousands dead, exponentially more wounded. Damage to the ecosystem will linger for years as radiation passes through the food chain. A single missile.
A flash from Dallas. Two priests who were with President Kennedy say he is dead of bullet wounds. This is the latest information we have from Dallas. I will repeat with the greatest regret, two priests who were with President Kennedy say he has died of bullet wounds.
Malcolm Kilduff, the assistant press secretary, was filling in for the regular press secretary, and then he had to draw himself up to give the most fateful announcement that a press secretary might have ever had to give.
All the cameras were rolling, and I remember he put his fingers like this on the desk and pressed very hard to stop his hands trembling.
Do it again. Go on, Matt.
President John F. Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time today here in Dallas. He died of a gunshot wound in the brain.
Slow it down.
I have no other details regarding the assassination of the president.
But this is the first time since 1948 that a president has made an official visit to Dallas. Here comes the big jet in.
Here's a cheer going up now as a big jet lands with the United States of America on it. Boy, that's a beautiful ship, a 707, U.S. Air Force One. There it is. The President of the United States seal on the nose. And here comes the President of the United States.
There's no trouble at all spotting Mrs. Kennedy with a bright pink dress, a wool dress, pillbox-type hat.
Clear blue sky and a warm sun. Beautiful day now, just a beautiful day. Boy, this is something. The press is standing up high, getting a lot of shots of this. He's broken away from his plan and gone right up to the fence to shake hands with people. This is great for the people and makes the eggshells even thinner for the Secret Service, whose job it is to guard the man.
And the motorcade begins to move out. The President and the First Lady sitting in the back seat. As we said, the top is down. They are not using the bubble, so it'll be an open limousine parade. Immediately following the presidential limousine, a car loaded with Secret Servicemen. It is our understanding that the motorcade will be moving slowly enough so that everyone along the route will have a good look at the chief executive.
Thousands will be on hand for that motorcade now, which will be downtown Dallas. The president and his wife and party are going to be visible all through Dallas.
And here comes Jackie waving by, and Mr. Kennedy, radiant in that pink outfit. Bob Huffaker is ready to come in from that point. What's happening down there, Robert?
The scene is gay down here with red, white, and blue bunting hanging all over Main Street. The Dallas Police Department is working with a fully augmented force to dispel any fear that unfortunate incidents do not occur on this trip.
The President's car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the trademark.
And very often you'll find a zipper hidden in the arm.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You'll excuse the fact that I'm out of breath, but about 10 or 15 minutes ago, a tragic thing, from all indications at this point, has happened in the city of Dallas. Let me quote to you this. And you'll excuse me if I am out of breath. A bulletin. This is from the United Press, from Dallas. President Kennedy and Governor John Connally have been cut down by assassins' bullets in downtown Dallas. They were riding in an open automobile when the shots were fired. The president, his limp body carried in the arms of his wife, Jacqueline, has rushed to Parkland Hospital.
The President's wife, Jackie Kennedy, was not hurt. She walked into the hospital at her husband's stretcher side. That Governor Connally was shot in the upper left chest, and the first unconfirmed reports say the President was hit in the head. That's an unconfirmed report that the President was hit in the head.
Senator Ralph Yarborough burst into tears just a few moments ago. Senator Yarborough said, "I saw a Secret Service man sitting on the rear of the presidential car and pounding the car with his hands in despair, anguish, and pain. I knew something horrible had happened."
What kind of a peace do we seek? Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
The flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died some 38 minutes ago.
Here is the suspect, 24-year-old Lee H. Oswald.
I'm just a patsy. President.
Who actually fired the shots that killed Kennedy? Was there a conspiracy?
In the years since the Warren Report, there is now so much more that we know. Conspiracy theories are now conspiracy facts.
The Warren Commission successfully deceived the public
Allen Dulles' appointment to the Warren Commission is one of the great frauds of American history.
Documents are withheld by the FBI, the CIA.
Intelligence agencies did all the wrong things if they were looking for conspiracy.
We will go back and piece together new facts and evidence that shed more light on what really happened here that day.
The Commission believes that the same bullet that hit Kennedy hit Connally. Well, I don't believe it.
It is indeed a magic bullet.
Oswald was a figure of interest for 4 years before the assassination. They were reading his mother's mail.
His first year in office, Kennedy made many enemies.
He vows he's going to shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces.
Have you ever committed any act of violence?
He was intimately involved in the cover-up.
Once you kill a president on the streets of American City, that sends a signal.
The rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened.
If America really wants a democratic society, and we should get to the bottom of this traumatic crime that continues to reverberate throughout American history.
This nation will not be fully free until all its citizens are free.
In the wake of the Kennedy assassination, the Dallas police, on the one hand, they were committing all of the resources to trying to solve the crime.
But you're moving in the doorway. When you get him in the doorway, all right, sir.
On the other hand, they were ill-equipped to handle this tsunami of reporters.
Well, I was questioned by a judge. However, I protested at that time that I was not allowed legal representation.
In bringing Oswald out, they were, of course, doing something that you would never see happen today. But they were trying to cooperate with the press with the understanding that there would not be questions shouted at him.
Did you kill the president?
No, I've not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet. The first thing I heard about it was when the newspaper reporters in the hall asked me that question.
You have been.
Nobody said what?
Sir?
You have been.
Nobody said what? Okay, we can't hear you then. Okay.
What did you do in Russia?
November 24th, 1963, as he was being transferred from police headquarters to the county jail, nightclub owner Jack Ruby shot and killed Oswald in front of live television cameras. Ruby was immediately arrested, convicted of murder, and sentenced to death, though his conviction was later overturned on appeal. Before a retrial could take place, Ruby died in prison in 1967 from complications related to lung cancer.
A lymph node biopsy was performed under local anesthesia. The lymph node revealed tumor on microscopic examination.
If I answer that question you keep asking, if I give you the name of the big enchilada you know, then it's Bon Voyage Dino. I mean like permanent. I mean like a bullet in my head, you dig? Does that help you see my problem a little better?
Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flash of light in the bushes, and then shots rang out.
No cloak and dagger stuff, you know. They call it Operation Mongoose.
It's gonna be okay, Dave. You just talk to us on the record and we'll protect you. Now, I guarantee it.
You're so naive.
We found this in your office. We think the conference room is also bugged, maybe the phones.
I'm not cooperating here. I'm not cooperating here. Listen, there's a death warrant for me.
Are the same people gonna kill us, Pop?
Nobody's gonna kill us. Y'all gotta get into your minds how the hell the spooks think. Now, they're not ordinary crooks. Think the unthinkable. Question everything. Now, we're through the looking glass here, people. White is black, and black is white. You don't believe me? All this time, you never believed me.
I just want
raise our children and live a normal life. I want my life back.
Look, this thing's bigger than all of us. Now, how many courts is it going to take for you lawyers to figure out what you want?
People got to know. People got to know why he was killed.
Do you know what you've done to me? I'm a dead man!
Well, if they can kill the president, they can certainly get me.
You're a mouse fighting a gorilla.
You're close. You're closer than you think.
There's going to be an attempt to kill you somewhere between here and New Orleans.
I say let justice be done or the heavens fall.
In August 1964, an American destroyer, the USS Maddox, on patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin, exchanged fire with North Vietnamese torpedo boats.
The President has asked that the destroyer force be doubled and that an air cap, a combat air patrol, be available at all times on call to it. And as I think you know, he's issued instructions that in the event of a further attack upon our vessels in international waters, we are to respond with the objective of destroying the attackers.
2 days later, the ship's captain thought he was again coming under attack. One of the pilots was not so sure.
Well, I was over those destroyers for over an hour and a half, below 1,000 feet, lights off, watching everything they did. I could hear them chit-chatting on the radio, the Maddox and the Joy. They seemed to have some intermittent radar targets. I took it upon myself to get out there where they thought a boat was and try to kill it if they didn't. But it was fruitless. And I'd go down there and there was nothing.
Ignoring the conflicting evidence, the Pentagon insisted there had been a second attack.
In retaliation for this unprovoked attack on the high seas, our forces have struck the bases used by the North Vietnamese patrol craft.
Johnson used the incident to push the Tonkin Gulf Resolution through Congress. It would allow the president to wage war in Vietnam.
Here's Mao at his iconic moment. He's proclaiming the victory of the communists in the Chinese Civil War. China had been a broken state basically since 1911 when the last dynasty had fallen and the country had broken out into a multilateral civil war that he eventually wins. And I'm going to be talking tonight about Mao's theories from the 1920s and 30s when he had the time to write. But there's a lot more to Mao than just that. He had quite a track record. Once he won the Civil War, he imposed a social revolution. What's that? It's more than a political revolution. You're not just replacing the government, you're going to wipe out entire social classes. And I don't mean then, hey, here's your one-way ticket out of here kind of way. No, a social revolution is here's a mass grave, dig it, and then you're in it kind of way. So if you look at these statistics of Chinese deaths in many of their wars, this is for much of the Maoist period, I think it's 45 to 75, what you'll notice, the figures in white, I believe, are civilian deaths, not military deaths, and it gets really quite ugly. There are more Chinese civilian deaths here than all deaths in World War II. And then for those of you who think the Chinese are all great long-term strategists, you need to ponder these numbers. How is it possible to kill so many of your own? That's generally not a mark of good strategy. Moreover, most of them died during the Great Famine, which was the only nationwide famine in Chinese history. Why? Because it's not caused by the weather. It's caused by policies set in Beijing. During the Great Leap Forward, Mao put all the peasants on communes. That meant the party was in control of the food supply, i.e. who lives and who dies. You don't get a meal, you're very dead. In addition, he decentralized industry, and you can see these backyard furnaces pictured here. As a result of this, production collapses, agriculture and industrial, but Mao keeps exporting food. Why? Because that's his pocket change. That is a major source of government income if he wants to be able to do anything. So they keep exporting food. As a result, 40 million Chinese starved to death, primarily in rural areas and disproportionately peasant girls, the least valued members of society. The statistic of 40 million deaths comes from this book by Yang Jisheng, who's written the definitive work. The English translation is but 1 volume. The Chinese original is 3. Yang worked as a journalist for many years, which gave him access to provincial archives, where he surreptitiously investigated the statistics of people who are starving to death, including his father, for whom he wrote this book to serve as an eternal tombstone. So, on the one hand, Mao is the military genius who puts Humpty Dumpty back together again when nobody else could, and they tried for the previous 40 years. On the other hand, he is the psychopath incapable of running an economy in peacetime. Yet, many Chinese revere him as a national hero. Why? Because in their minds, certainly of the Han, the preponderant group in China, one of the key things that their country should and must be is a great power. And Mao, by reunifying China under the banner of communism and then fighting the coalition of all the major capitalist powers to a stalemate in the Korean War, or in their mind a victory, that constitutes ending what they consider the era of humiliations that started in the mid-19th centuries and end with the communist revolution. So he's a hero at home.
Ever since the Israeli victory during the wars of 1948 and 1956, the Arab coalition, led by Egypt, Syria and Jordan, was eager to change the situation in the region by defeating Israel. Both sides understood that the conflict was far from over and were preparing for the next stage of confrontation. International interference and the inability of the sides to find a settlement made one of the most iconic conflicts of the modern era, the Six-Day War, inevitable. On May 13, 1967, the Soviet Union falsely informed Egypt about the concentration of 11 to 13 brigades of the Israeli Defense Forces with an intent to strike Syria. In response, Egypt started concentrating forces along the border with Israel in Sinai, and on May 16th demanded that the UN peacekeeping forces leave the peninsula. At the same time, Israel refused the request of the UN to deploy the UNEF on their side of the border. In the next few days, Egypt, Israel, Jordan and Sudan started mobilization of their forces, Iraq sent expeditionary forces to Jordan, and Saudi Arabia expressed its willingness to participate in military actions. But the turning point, which made the full-scale confrontation inevitable, was the decision of Egypt to block Israeli ships from entering the Straits of Tiran on May 22nd and 23rd. On June 1st, Israel established a national unity government, which on June 4th decided to go to war. The Arab coalition of Egypt, Jordan and Syria had an advantage over Israel in deployed troops with 240,000 against 100,000, in tanks with 2,504 against 800, and in aircraft with 957 against 300. Israel planned to strike on June 5th with Operation Focus, which aimed to destroy the Egyptian Air Force. Israeli media published false reports claiming Israeli soldiers were on vacation, while their pilots were carrying out training sorties as usual. Their intelligence helped make this training as realistic as possible. They also damaged the tracking antenna of the US Embassy to prevent the Americans finding out about the operation before the strike took place. The Israeli pilots were informed about the start of the operation only 5 hours in advance. At the same time, the Egyptian air defense system was effectively off on June 5th. Nearly 200 Israeli aircraft attacked 14 Egyptian airfields and caught them absolutely off guard. 338 Egyptian aircraft were destroyed and 100 pilots were killed within 3 hours. The Jordanian and Syrian air forces attacked Israel in retaliation at 11 AM on June 5th. The response of the Israeli Air Force was to attack their airfields, which led to the destruction of all 28 Jordanian, 53 Syrian and 10 Iraqi planes. Operation Focus was a decisive success. Israel lost only 19 planes in this operation and guaranteed its total air dominance for the rest of the war. The ground war was taking place on 3 fronts: the Sinai Front, the Jordanian Front, and the Syrian Front. On the Sinai Front, the Egyptian forces consisted of 7 divisions, 4 armoured, 2 infantry, and 1 mechanized infantry. Egypt had 100,000 troops and 900 to 950 tanks in the Sinai, so Israel concentrated 3 divisions consisting of 6 armoured, 1 infantry, 1 mechanized infantry and 3 paratrooper brigades for a total of 70,000 men and 700 tanks along this front. Israel's plan was to catch the Egyptians off guard by attacking simultaneously with airstrikes, and attacking through the northern and central routes in the Sinai Peninsula instead of the central and southern routes used during the Sinai War. On the 5th of June at 7:50 AM, the northernmost Israeli division, consisting of 3 brigades and commanded by Major General Israel Tal, started its advance towards Arish through Gaza with an aim to encircle Khan Yunis, while the paratroopers were ordered to take Rafah. Initially, the Egyptians offered little resistance, since their intelligence concluded that this was a diversion rather than a main attack. However, soon resistance against the 60th Armoured Brigade ramped up. This did not stop the Israeli forces from reaching the Khan Yunis railway junction in 4 hours. Afterwards, the IDF advanced on Sheikh Zayed and defeated fierce Egyptian resistance thanks to air domination. The road to Arish was open, and by 8 AM on the 6th of July, elements of the 79th Armoured Battalion and the 7th Brigade entered the suspiciously quiet city. Suddenly, the Egyptians started firing from the balconies and windows, and there was a heavy battle going on for control of the city. The IDF was only able to take full control of the city after reinforcements were sent. The northernmost division then split into 2 parts. One of them continued the advance on the Suez Canal, while the second group turned south and captured Bir Lafan and Jabal Libni. Further south, on the 6th of June, the 14,000-man, 150-tank-strong Israeli 38th Armoured Division under Major General Ariel Sharon was confronted by the Egyptian 2nd Infantry Division under Major General Saadi Naguib, consisting of 16,000 troops and 90 tanks. Israel successfully advanced towards Abu Agela. The paratroopers landed behind Egyptian positions and sowed enough confusion to weaken the artillery of the Egyptian defense, which opened the way for the IDF to capture Katef. It was followed by a fierce close tank battle, which ended in an Israeli victory, with 40 Egyptian and 19 Israeli tanks destroyed. The Egyptian forces in Sinai were still largely intact, but their field marshal, Abd el-Hakim Amr, panicked and ordered the retreat of all units from Sinai after hearing about the fall of Abu Aghaila. This order did not elaborate on the sequence and manner of the retreat, which only decreased the defensive capabilities of the Egyptian troops. During the following days, the IDF continued its advance westward and inflicted heavy losses on the Egyptians. Despite episodic heavy resistance by the Egyptians, as in Bin Gefgafa, the napalm bombing by Israeli aviation and the uncontrolled retreat weakened the morale of the Egyptian troops. Instead of catching retreating Egyptians, the IDF decided to capture 3 passes from Sinai to the Egyptian mainland and face the Egyptian troops there. Although the IDF was not able to stop all the Egyptian troops from crossing, these passes became a killing ground, with 10,000 Egyptians being killed in one day alone. The capture of Sinai was completed by the fall of Sharm el-Sheikh on June 7th and Ras Sudar on June 8th. On June 9th, the UN Security Council achieved armistice between both sides. Israel wanted to avoid confrontation with Jordan and Syria before defeating Egypt, but the offers of neutrality to Jordan were rejected, as the Egyptian President Nasser persuaded King Hussein of Jordan that Egypt had an advantage against Israel. On the morning of the 5th of June, both sides started to fire, but Israel attempted a last-gasp attempt to avoid confrontation with Jordan by passing its message requesting peace through the UN representative, Bull. King Hussein countered that it was too late, and the Jordanian Air Force was already on the way. Jordanian and Iraqi aviation started shelling Israeli-controlled West Jerusalem, which caused 16 military and 20 civilian casualties, with 900 buildings damaged. Israel responded with its own air attack within Operation Focus, which damaged the military aviation infrastructure of Jordan and secured Israeli air dominance. East Jerusalem was controlled by Jordan at the time, and the Jordanian army took position in the UN residency, the government house, to fire on the Israeli sector. The Jerusalem Brigade's Reserve Battalion 161 of Israel took the government house despite heavy losses and forced the Jordanians to retreat to Bethlehem. Later on that day, Israel encircled eastern Jerusalem with the Jerusalem Brigade from the south and the mechanized Harel Brigade and 55th Paratroopers Brigade from the north. A fierce battle took place for Ammunition Hill. Jordanian resistance was so strong that the IDF lost all but 2 of their attacking officers and achieved the goal only after 4 hours. The 55th Paratroopers Brigade afterwards drove eastwards, reaching Mount Scopus and defeating the other Jordanian positions around the American colony. Towards the evening of June 5th, the mechanized Harel Brigade succeeded in taking Latrun and Ramallah. Also, the 163rd Infantry Battalion secured Abu Tor and cut the old city from Bethlehem and Hebron. On June 7th, the Israeli Minister of Defense, Moshe Dayan, ordered the IDF to enter the old city, despite reservations and concerns by the Israeli government. The fighting was conducted solely by the paratroopers out of fear of destruction of holy sites. The IDF took control of the old city with little resistance. Judea, Hebron, Bethlehem, and Nablus were also captured by the IDF on June 7th. Remnants of the Jordanian army fell back into Jordan. Israel was victorious on this front as well. Syria also believed Nasser about Egypt's early success in the conflict and sent its aviation to attack Galilee. This attack was intercepted by Israeli aircraft. A minor ground attack was also attempted by the Syrians, hoping to capture the water plants at Tel Dan, Dan, and Shia Yashuv. This was repulsed by the IDF as well. Israeli air domination, lack of communication by Syrian units, and tanks being too wide for bridges were among the causes of the unsuccessful attack of the Syrians. This caused them to abandon any attempts to make ground offensives on Israel, and airstrikes were chosen as their method instead. However, on the evening of June 5th, Israel struck Syrian airfields as part of Operation Focus, destroying 2/3 of the Syrian Air Force and forcing the rest out of the conflict. The Israeli leadership was unsure whether to attack Syria or not. On one hand, Syria was using the Golan Heights to shell Israel. On the other hand, it would have been a literally uphill battle against a fortified enemy. But intelligence about weakened positions of Syria in general, and in Golan Heights in particular, led Dayan to order an offensive on Golan without government authorization. The Israeli offensive started with airstrikes, which severely damaged the defensive infrastructure and morale of the Syrian army. The 8th Armoured Brigade, led by Colonel Albert Mandler, advanced into the Golan Heights from Givat Haim. Heavy fighting in unfavourable terrain led to numerous casualties on both sides, but with the help of their aircraft, the IDF ultimately captured the Zora, Kala, and Ein Fit fortresses. In the central sector, the Israeli 181st Battalion captured the strongholds of Dardara and Tel Hilal after fierce fighting. By the evening of June 9th, Israel reached the plateau, which allowed reinforcements to join them. By dawn, Israel had 8 brigades ready for an assault on the second line of defences. Soon, a ceasefire was negotiated around the so-called Purple Line. By the 11th of June, all military actions stopped. Up to 983 Israelis, 15,000 Egyptians, 700 Jordanians, and 2,500 Syrians were killed in action. Israel gained a huge victory. It seized the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the west bank of the Jordan River, including East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. About 1 million Arabs were placed under Israel's direct control in the newly captured territories. The Israeli victory came as a result of more efficient military leadership, better preparation of troops, and intelligence. But the Six-Day War was by no means the last conflict, and merely 6 years later, the confrontation escalated into another war.